I observe that the global pharmaceutical industry operates through a patent regime that creates artificial scarcity of life-saving medications, allowing corporations to charge prices that place essential treatments beyond the reach of billions, while generating profit margins that exceed those of nearly every other sector. This is not market failure requiring correction. It is market function operating exactly as designed, where intellectual property laws enforced by international trade agreements prioritize corporate returns over human survival, and where the deaths resulting from this prioritization are treated not as system defects but as acceptable externalities in the pursuit of innovation incentives and shareholder value. I trace this not as critique of individual pharmaceutical executives who operate within institutional structures that reward profit maximization, but as analysis of how legal architecture transforms knowledge, which can be reproduced at near zero marginal cost, into property that commands monopoly pricing, and how international enforcement mechanisms prevent the generic production that would make medications accessible at cost-based prices. What I document is a system where medications that cost dollars to manufacture are sold for thousands, where treatments for diseases affecting millions are withheld from those who cannot pay, and where the justifications offered for this arrangement, research and development costs, innovation incentives, patent protection necessity, collapse under examination of how pharmaceutical business actually operates. I begin with the COVID-19 vaccine paradigm because it crystallized the patent regime's function in circumstances where the stakes were globally visible and the contradictions undeniable. The mRNA vaccine technology underlying the Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna vaccines was developed through decades of publicly funded research at the National Institutes of Health and universities, with the specific COVID vaccine development receiving billions in government funding through Operation Warp Speed and equivalent programs in Europe. The technology, paid for by taxpayers facing a pandemic, was then exclusively licensed to private corporations who patented the formulations and manufacturing processes, allowing them to charge governments premium prices, approximately $20 to $30 per dose, while preventing other manufacturers from producing generic versions. I analyzed the global South access crisis that resulted, wealthy nations pre-purchase vaccine supplies, securing billions of doses while low-income countries waited for donations and COVAX allocations that arrived slowly and in insufficient quantities. India and South Africa proposed a TRIPS waiver at the World Trade Organization that would temporarily suspend patent enforcement for COVID vaccines, allowing generic production to scale rapidly. The proposal was supported by over 100 countries, but blocked by the United States, European Union, United Kingdom, and Switzerland, where major pharmaceutical companies are headquartered, on grounds that weakening patent protection would undermine innovation incentives. The practical result was that populations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia remained largely unvaccinated through 2021 and 2022, while variants emerged, mutated, and spread globally, prolonging the pandemic that strong patent enforcement was ostensibly necessary to solve. I examined the pharmaceutical industry's defense, that high prices reflect the massive costs of drug development, the risks of clinical trials, and the many failed compounds that must be subsidized by successful drugs' revenues. The industry claims that research and development spending justifies patent monopolies, citing figures showing billions invested in bringing drugs to market. But scrutiny of pharmaceutical company financial statements reveals that research and development spending is consistently exceeded by expenditures on marketing, advertising, and lobbying. Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and other major firms spend more promoting existing drugs than developing new ones. The largest pharmaceutical companies allocate approximately 15 to 20% of revenue to R&D while allocating 25 to 30% to sales and marketing, contradicting the narrative that high prices fund innovation. I trace the public subsidy dimension that the industry systematically obscures. The National Institutes of Health spends over $40 billion annually funding basic research that pharmaceutical companies then license, patent, and commercialize. University laboratories conduct the fundamental science identifying disease mechanisms, potential drug targets, and molecular pathways. Pharmaceutical companies take this publicly funded knowledge, conduct the clinical trials necessary for regulatory approval, and claim exclusive rights to the resulting medications. The most expensive and uncertain phase of drug development, the basic science establishing that a therapeutic approach is viable, is socialized through taxpayer funding, while the profits from successful drugs are privatized through patent monopolies that prevent generic competition. I analyze specific cases that illustrate the pricing mechanisms enabled by patent protection. Insulin, discovered over a century ago and off patent in its original formulations, is sold in the United States for $300 per vial by manufacturers who have made incremental modifications to delivery mechanisms and formulations, patenting these minor variations to extend monopoly control and prevent generic competition. The medication costs approximately $5 to produce. The markup reflects not production costs or research investment, but the monopoly power that patent law provides. Type 1 diabetics, requiring insulin for survival, face the choice of paying monopoly prices, rationing doses and risking diabetic ketoacidosis, or dying. Media reports document Americans rationing insulin, crossing borders to Canada or Mexico for affordable supplies, and dying because they could not afford medication that costs pennies to manufacture. I examine the hepatitis C case as demonstration of how monopoly pricing operates when cure rather than ongoing treatment is possible. Gilead Sciences developed sofosbuvir, a hepatitis C medication achieving cure rates exceeding 95% with 12-week treatment courses. The company priced the treatment at $84,000 in the United States, placing it beyond reach for most hepatitis C patients and straining even wealthy nations' healthcare budgets. India, invoking public health provisions in patent law, granted compulsory licenses allowing generic manufacturers to produce the medication, which they did for approximately $100 for the full treatment course, 1,000 times cheaper than Gilead's price. This revealed that the $84,000 price bore no relationship to production costs or even to generous research investment recovery. It reflected pure monopoly extraction of maximum revenue from desperate patients. I trace how TRIPS, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights enforced by the World Trade Organization, globalizes this patent monopoly system. TRIPS requires all WTO member states to grant 20-year pharmaceutical patents and to enforce them through legal systems that punish generic production as intellectual property theft. Countries that previously allowed generic production to ensure affordable medication access for their populations, India being the primary example, were forced to implement patent regimes that prioritize corporate rights over public health. The agreement contains provisions for compulsory licensing in public health emergencies, but these provisions are hedged with restrictions and subject to diplomatic and trade pressure that makes their use politically costly. I analyze the India pharmaceutical industry transformation as case study in how TRIPS enforcement destroyed affordable generic production. Before TRIPS implementation in 2005, India did not grant pharmaceutical product patents, only process patents, allowing Indian companies to manufacture generic versions of patented drugs through alternative synthesis pathways. This made India the pharmacy of the developing world, supplying affordable medications for HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, and other diseases to populations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Post-TRIPS, India must grant product patents preventing generic production of new medications, regardless of synthesis method. The result is that treatments developed after 2005 remain under monopoly control, priced beyond reach of populations who previously accessed affordable generics, while pharmaceutical corporations secure Indian market exclusivity. I examine the HIV/AIDS case because it demonstrates both the death toll of patent monopolies and the partial success of resistance. When antiretroviral medications became available in the mid-1990s, pharmaceutical companies charged approximately $10,000 to $15,000 annually for triple drug regimens. prices that placed treatment beyond reach for the millions of HIV-positive people in sub-Saharan Africa, where the epidemic was most severe. Activist groups, particularly Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, challenged patent enforcement, demanding generic production and government action. Indian generic manufacturers proved that antiretrovirals could be produced for approximately $150 annually, 1% of branded prices. The political pressure, combined with threat of compulsory licensing and negative publicity, eventually forced pharmaceutical companies to offer discounted prices for low-income countries and to tolerate generic production, though this compromise came after millions had died for lack of affordable treatment. I trace the ongoing access crisis for newer medications where this compromise has not occurred. Cancer treatments costing hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, specialty medications for rare diseases priced in millions, gene therapies exceeding $2 million for one-time treatment. The justification shifts. Instead of research costs, companies cite small patient populations, manufacturing complexity, or value-based pricing reflecting quality-adjusted life years gained, but the underlying dynamic remains identical. Medications are priced at maximum extraction levels that health systems and desperate patients will pay, not at cost recovery levels that would ensure access. The deaths resulting from unaffordability are tracked by global health organizations, quantified in studies showing millions dying annually from treatable conditions, yet the system persists because the deaths occur among populations without purchasing power or political influence. I analyze the regulatory capture dimension where pharmaceutical companies shape the very rules meant to constrain them. Industry lobbying ensures patent term extensions, data exclusivity periods, and regulatory barriers that delay generic entry years beyond patent expiration. The FDA approval process, while ensuring drug safety and efficacy, also functions as barrier to generic competition through requirements that favor established manufacturers. The revolving door between regulatory agencies and pharmaceutical companies, officials moving from FDA to industry positions and back, creates institutional culture where industry interests are treated as synonymous with public health interests. Campaign contributions and lobbying expenditures ensure that politicians considering patent reform face well-funded opposition and that legislation emerges pre-compromised to protect industry revenues. I examine the innovation incentive justification that defends patent monopolies as necessary to encourage pharmaceutical research. The argument claims that without 20-year exclusivity and monopoly pricing, companies would not invest in developing new medications because they could not recover costs or profit from successful drugs. But this argument fails on multiple grounds. Most fundamental research is publicly funded, making the private investment smaller than claimed. Pharmaceutical companies invest more in marketing than R&D, suggesting pricing reflects market power rather than research recovery. Alternative innovation models exist: prize systems, public research institutes, open-source drug development that could incentivize research without monopoly pricing, and the current system produces innovation directed toward profitable conditions affecting wealthy populations while neglecting diseases of poverty that affect far more people but offer lower revenue potential. I trace the structural alternative that patent opponents advocate: socialize pharmaceutical research and production where medications are developed through public funding, manufactured generically, and distributed at cost. This model exists partially in systems like the Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, which develops treatments for conditions that pharmaceutical companies ignore because affected populations cannot pay monopoly prices. The model proves that innovation can occur without patent monopolies and that medications can be produced affordably when profit maximization is not the objective. The barrier to scaling this approach is not technical feasibility, but political power. Pharmaceutical industry opposition, ideological commitment to private sector innovation, and institutional structures that privilege corporate interests over public health. I analyze why this system persists despite visible costs and millions of preventable deaths, despite COVID demonstrating the inefficiency of patent-based vaccine distribution, and despite generic production proving that affordable medication access is technically feasible? The answer is that the system serves the interests of concentrated economic power, pharmaceutical shareholders, executives, and the financial institutions invested in pharma stocks, while the costs are distributed across diffuse populations who lack political organization or economic leverage. The deaths occur primarily in Global South countries whose governments lack power to challenge TRIPS enforcement. The financial burden falls on patients and public health systems that absorb costs rather than on corporations setting prices. And the political system in countries where pharmaceutical companies are headquartered is captured through campaign finance and lobbying that prevents reform. I examine the moral framing that defenders employ to legitimize this arrangement. Property rights must be protected. Innovation requires incentives. Development is expensive and risky, and companies deserve profits from successful investments. This framing treats patent monopolies as natural market outcomes rather than government-granted privileges, treats corporate profits as more legitimate than human survival, and treats intellectual property as equivalent to physical property, despite the fundamental difference that ideas can be reproduced infinitely at near zero cost, while physical goods cannot. The framing succeeds because it aligns with capitalist ideology that prioritizes property and profit over welfare and survival, and because it is promoted through institutions, media, academia, policy, think tanks, funded by pharmaceutical industry and sharing its worldview. I return to the core question: how many deaths does this system require before it becomes politically unsustainable? The answer, revealed through decades of the status quo persisting, despite documented millions dying from lack of medication access, is that there is no threshold. The system can sustain unlimited deaths among populations without political power, because those deaths do not translate into political pressure on institutions capable of reform. The deaths occur in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and among poor populations in wealthy countries. They are individualized and dispersed rather than concentrated and visible. They are attributed to poverty or disease rather than to patent policy. And they generate no organized resistance because the dying lack resources to mount effective challenges to TRIPS enforcement and pharmaceutical monopoly. I conclude with the systemic implications. The pharmaceutical patent regime demonstrates how capitalism transforms knowledge into property to enable monopoly extraction, how international law enforces corporate rights over human survival, and how institutional structures prevent reform even when costs are measured in millions of preventable deaths. The system is not an aberration. It is logical extension of treating healthcare as commodity rather than right, of prioritizing innovation for profitable markets over global health needs, and of structuring international trade to benefit corporations over populations. The deaths are not system failures, but system functions, externalities accepted as necessary for maintaining profit margins and property rights. What the pharmaceutical monopoly reveals is not that capitalism occasionally produces unjust outcomes, but that justice and capitalism are fundamentally incompatible when profit maximization encounters human survival, and that the institutional order prioritizes the former over the latter as foundational principle rather than accidental deviation.